let's take a look at what's going on here so that we don't waste no valuable time in a discussion that we could spend a whole day talking about. So let's take a look at what we have here. The first thing I'd like to open up with is this kind of concept that I want you to struggle with in your minds for a moment, and that is that we always hear that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And so I'm very, very glad that God provided some blinders for my wife when we got married, because she thinks that I'm attractive. I don't care what the rest of you all think. She does. Now, because beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And but what I'd like to tell you today, which I think flips this a little bit on its head side, is that crisis is also in the eyes of the beholder. Crisis is seen very different by people as they're looking at the same event. And so it is true also with this event. Now, we do know is that when a crisis does occur, that people, the same witnesses in the same room, come with different answers. So how much more so do you think happens when we are at a distance from the crisis when it occurs, and how we might walk away with different viewpoints? What makes us walk away with these different viewpoints is what I'd like for us to struggle with today as we begin to talk about that. The first question is, what kind of viewpoints are out there? There are two large viewpoints that are there, and there's a ton of a continuum of smaller ones. What are the two views that are there? We do know that this is some of the things that have happened. That is the fact that there's a 5-year veteran police officer with no disciplinary history at all, who's operating in the line of duty and makes a request that's within his means. And after making this request that he has offered to what's going on, it is an act for him to follow the ordinances of his community and also to have the right to protect himself. And so that's one of the things that we know is happening. And so part of us has to adapt and has to own that. That, we begin to create a different view when we don't want to own the diverse opinion that's there. So this is a guy who has no disciplinary history, who's an officer, who's functioning his duty, and probably would have responded to Michael Brown's home and put his life on the line a day before this. And then the day of this, there's a difference of reactions there. Now this is what we also know. We also do know that there is a young, black, unarmed, and in some cases, according to how the media handles it, they either call him a boy or a man. So we all feel much more victimized if he's a boy at 18 than we do that if he's a man. Now, there needs to be an identification. He needs to be, in particular, a young, black, unarmed boy that is present. So we do know these two things are true. Then the story starts changing a bit. But the first thing we want to do is to realize that there are two truths that are here that both can coexist at the same time. I can accept the fact he has no disciplinary history and he's a police officer and he probably has put himself in harm's danger before that day. I can also accept the fact that Michael is unarmed, wants to go to school, wants to get a degree, and is somebody who is now walking around having fun with a friend of his. So then what then begins to take place? Now this is one of the things I'd like to share with you just for a moment. It's the issue of how is it that we begin to develop identity. The first thing is that there's a man by the name of Charles Cooley, who's a sociologist, who's created this philosophical way of looking at oneself and asking the question, and this is the question he has. He calls it the looking glass self. Now we've all heard the term, I think, therefore I am, right? I think, therefore I am. What he does is he flips that also on its head and he says, you think, therefore I am. So that I begin to learn who I am, not simply by what I think, but I also learn who I am by the looking glass of watching you. And as you react to me, I begin to learn who I am. And so really my identity is formed not only of my own thoughts, but my identity is also formed of what society would think of me also. And it begins to give me an identification. What happens here today, the first thing we have to realize that when there is a conflict that begins to happen, it doesn't happen in the moment. It happens of perceptual issues that occur long before the event occurs. You must understand history. If my wife was to walk out and leave me, which God forbid she couldn't do, because I'd be holding onto her leg, and she couldn't leave me, she could walk down the streets like this, but she couldn't leave me. But nevertheless, if she could, and you simply just ask, what were we arguing about? And you diffuse what the argument was about, you probably wouldn't even get to the real reasons why she left or why I behaved the way I behaved. There was an historical event that brought me up to that moment and brought her up to that moment that we're going to need to look at to understand how that moment became what it was. And so too often we just keep asking the question of the facts of the moment and we don't ask the history. And so all around the world there's conflict and ethnic cleansing, there's all kinds of things that are going on around the world, genocide, and we're not asking the question, what history is there? Could we even begin to understand things if we don't ask the history? So there's some history at play in Michael Brown's mind. Darren Wilson has a history at play that now are about to collide on this day, at this moment, around noon. And it is that history that we need to understand. And it is, you see me, it's not just that I see myself, but you also see me. And I create this identity, Marcus says, Hazel Marcus, a female, sociologist, that says you create your identity in an interface between what you think of yourself and what society thinks of you. Now there's one other dynamic I'd like to mention, and that is that your identity that you begin to create is not isolated and is not unified. The identity that you create is dynamic and fluid. So that what I have when I begin to face you and I begin to engage with you is I don't engage with you just as a person as we might think in these situations. It's not a black young man engaging a white, younger, a white police officer still in his 20s. It's not an issue of just these two dynamics, but what? There's a whole field of roles that they play that have just come to play at that moment. And if we only look at it like this is a black and white person, we just missed all the dynamics that were at play. He doesn't just see a black young man. He sees a number of issues that he's clocking in his mind as he's making a decision about who he's engaging. And Michael Brown sees a number of issues that he's clocking in his mind. So that when I begin to look at this issue, I look at it first of all and say, wow, I'm black, what happened? And I begin to look at it from my view of being black, but also serving as a licensed police officer and serving as an FBI chaplain and a local chaplain for the local police department has allowed me to say I have another identity. I want to ask the question, what is happening with that police officer when he makes this reaction that he makes? Because there is more going on than just the single identity. But for us to say on the other side that there is no racial identity would probably not be true. There is identity brought. All of our identity is brought to the table, and it's perceived in the moment. So they're both reacting to a series of identities that are present that all make up with the media, and everybody else wants to melt down to one or two things. It makes a whole lot of things that makes the decision that you make. So if I look and I see somebody walking down the street, and not only do I notice that they're young, not only do I notice that there's 5 or 6 other males with them, not only do I know, but there are other things that I notice that also give me alarm. And by the way, I might notice their race too. Or I might have noticed their race first. It becomes one of many in this kind of class of identification. So what I'm proposing today is that there's a creation of our identity that's larger than just the 1 or 2 things that we necessarily bring to the table, but that causes us to begin to see things different. So, let's look at this event that's at hand. We do know that as the police officer comes down the street, he asks them to get out of the street. Now, whether you decide that you can't ask people to get out the street or not really isn't the question. The real question on the table is, are they breaking the ordinance, and does the police officer have the right to do that? And the answer to that question has to be yes. Everybody agrees on that series of facts. But what happens next when the police officer begins to drive away is he stops and he backs up and he comes back. What made that officer return and come back? And it probably has to do with some interaction they had as the officer's leaving, or as the officer has said, he noticed the cigars or the cigarettes or whatever he was smoking in his hand, and therefore backed up because it was fitting the identity of somebody who had just been involved in what he had classified as a robbery. When he backs up to go back to him, then there the story begins to split as to what happens next. He says he opens up his door. They said that he opened his door into him and the door ricocheted and closed back again. He says that Michael reached into the car. He says that they say he reached up and grabbed Michael and pulled Michael into the car. There was a fight that ensued. There was a shot that was fired. A shot that was fired either inside the car or right at the car. We don't happen to know yet. That Michael then at some point gets away and begins to run. There's at least 10 to 11 shots fired. And as he is running away, there are shots that are fired. At some point, it is where the story splits. Michael turns to face him. When he does turn to face Officer Wilson then says he is now going to be attacked. Michael has moved toward him to attack him. He's been shot at least once. And when he does move to attack him, he then fires 3 or 4 more shots, one of them hitting him in the head, and he falls about 2 or 3 feet from him because he's running at him. The other side of the story is he turns, he puts his hands up, says, hey, you know what, okay, you know, that I'm unarmed. And he identifies that he's unarmed, and while doing that, the officer continues shooting. A number of the witnesses have identified that he then took his hands and put them around his stomach as he was bending over, and he continues shooting him and striking him finally in the head, and then he's falling over and he died. Now we do know there's another video that's involved in the process, and that video shows two construction people, individuals who are watching the event as it's happening, and they respond, and one of the construction people is actually putting his hands up, saying he had his hands up, And there's other witnesses that are present. There's so much, though, that we don't know, that if we make conclusions based on if we make conclusions right now, they're simply based on the identity that we've already determined. So that when we come to the table, I have an identity and I've already made a decision, or I need more facts before I can make a decision. That gives me the ability, if I get all the facts, to actually be able to perhaps even represent the minority position. Because I want to get what really happened, because most of us would say at the end of the day, if what really happened is a police officer executed a young man with no gun in the streets, even after a struggle, most of us would say he needs to go to jail, period. Most of us would say if Michael Brown was in a full fight with a police officer, trying to take his weapon and trying to shoot that police officer, most of us would say if he is bum rushing the officer has a right to defend himself. The question is, what really happened? And probably the answer to that is, we don't have enough information yet.